Some battles begin with noise, shouting, letters, arguments. Mine began with silence. The kind of silence that greets you when you step outside one morning to find an empty driveway where something important should have been. My truck was gone. Not my weekend ride or a family car, but my work truck, my livelihood. The Ford that carried every tool, every ladder, every piece of equipment I owned. It was the heart of my small construction business, the machine that paid my mortgage, fed my family, and fueled my days. And just like that, it had vanished. A bright yellow sticker on my mailbox told me everything. Vehicle removed for neighborhood policy violation. The notice was stamped with the bold, self-important seal of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. The reason? Commercial vehicle parking visible from public thoroughfare. In plain English, they said my work truck made the neighborhood look unprofessional. It hadn't bothered them for 2 years. But apparently someone, or more likely some Karen on the board, had decided that my livelihood was bad for their property values. First, I was confused, then furious. The fine print on the notice said my truck had been impounded in accordance with community ordinance. They hadn't even warned me. No letter, no ticket, not so much as a conversation. Just a tow. From my own driveway. For any small business owner, that's not just inconvenience. It's personal. It's like they'd reached into my wallet and pulled out my freedom. When I called the towing company, the man on the other end said they'd received the order directly from the HOA president herself, a woman named Carol Jensen. The same Carol who'd once politely suggested I build a trellis to hide my utility trailer, and once complained to the board because I painted my shutters a color that didn't reflect unified tones. There's always one in every neighborhood. The type who treats everyone else's home like her personal chessboard, finding power in petty rules because that's all she has left. My stomach twisted as I listened to the towing company explain the fees. $275 impound, $40 per day storage, and proof of HOA clearance before release. I realized quickly this wasn't about rules. It was about control. So I started digging. That evening, I pulled out the HOA handbook, something most residents never actually read beyond the first few pages. Line after line of redundant policy filled the pages, but when I reached the vehicle section, I froze. It explicitly stated, work vehicles registered to and owned by the resident are exempt from visibility restrictions provided no signage or heavy equipment is affixed. Mine had no logos, no attachments, nothing. Legally, my truck was compliant. That meant Carol, or someone on her board, had ordered the tow in direct violation of HOA bylaws. I took photos of everything, my driveway, the empty curb, my permit details. Then, out of habit or instinct, I logged into the HOA's website to see if they'd made a public notice about enforcement actions. That's when something strange caught my attention. The financial transparency page, the one meant to show community expenses, had been updated 2 days earlier, and there, buried in a list of maintenance disbursements, sat a line that read, Tow and removal services, $2,900. It wasn't just my truck they'd been towing. Something about that number didn't add up. The HOA's entire operations budget for the month was under that figure, meaning someone had diverted nearly half of it for towing. That night I couldn't sleep. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was curiosity. Because when people abuse rules, they always leave a trail. And if Carol wanted a fight, I'd give her one. Not with yelling, but with receipts. I filed a formal complaint first thing Monday morning, citing the vehicle exemption clause. Carol responded the same afternoon with a cold, dismissive message saying the issue was under review and that my appeal would be considered at the next monthly board meeting. A month. She wanted to chain me down for 4 weeks without my truck, without income. That was her plan. Stall and starve me into submission. But while she was busy weaponizing bureaucracy, I was doing my own research, checking invoices, tracking payments, downloading every publicly available HOA file I could find. And after 2 days of late-night digging, I realized something else. There was ugliness far beyond my missing truck. Numbers that didn't balance, accounts that didn't align, payments that led nowhere. They'd taken my vehicle, but I'd found something that could destroy their entire operation. And once I was done, they weren't just going to pay for my truck. They were going to pay for everything. The more I looked at the HOA's files, the stranger things became. It started with the towing expense, that oddly specific $2,900 entry that set off alarms in my head. But once I started tracing other payments, the numbers didn't just seem wrong, they seemed fabricated. Every HOA is supposed to post transparent monthly expenses for lawn maintenance, lighting, insurance, or event funds. But ours was messy. Repetitive vendors, duplicate amounts, vague line items labeled external consultation. It didn't look like bookkeeping. It looked like someone trying to bury footprints. What really sealed it for me were the signatures. Every transaction, every receipt, every financial entry carried the same initials at the bottom. CJ. Carol Jensen, the power-hungry HOA president who had decided my truck was an eyesore. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was using them as cover. I spent the next few days quietly collecting data. Late nights at the computer became routine, scrolling past spreadsheets and HOA PDFs with the kind of focus that only revenge can fuel. Buried between years of records, I found something remarkable: payments to a single towing company listed 6 times in one quarter. 6 separate removals, each for nearly identical amounts, though no one else in the neighborhood had ever reported a vehicle being impounded. In total, over $15,000 in towing fees, in a community where most of us couldn't even recall a single car being removed. The realization hit slowly, like a growing storm. Carol wasn't just targeting me. She was making money. Somewhere in those transactions, she and that towing company were working together. Maybe kickbacks, maybe inflated billing, but something wasn't clean. And I had the proof. Before I made a move, I needed confirmation. So I contacted the city's neighborhood compliance division, posing my questions as a concerned resident. They confirmed what I feared. HOAs could authorize private tows only with proper documentation and prior notification to residents. Missing either step was grounds for legal action. Every one of Carol's removals violated both. I printed the evidence, highlighted every inconsistency, and organized everything neatly in a folder I labeled The Truth. I thought about taking it straight to the state association or the police, but I needed more than paper. I needed witnesses. That's when my neighbors started talking. Apparently, I wasn't the only one she'd targeted. Mark, who lived around the corner, had been warned for leaving his boat trailer backed up too long on his own property. He paid a one-time release fee to keep it from being towed, a fee that never appeared on the HOA ledger. Another woman, Natalie, said she'd been fined for excessive driveway clutter, when all she'd done was host a charity yard sale. Those fines disappeared too. Carol had built a quiet empire, funded by fear and laziness. Nobody questioned her because nobody wanted to deal with her wrath, until she messed with someone willing to push back. The next HOA board meeting arrived like a trap waiting to close. She started the meeting the same as always: polished hair, blinding smile, air of superiority so thick you could smell it. She addressed the board about ongoing compliance issues and the need for stricter standards to preserve property values. But this time the room was full. More residents than usual. Whispers spread quickly. They'd heard about my truck, seen the news stories about questionable tows. They were curious, angry, and tired. When she opened the floor for community concerns, I stood up, calm, steady. The same quiet fury that started with an empty driveway now burned with purpose. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply placed the folder on the table, pushed it toward the board members, and told them to read it. Every page, every signature, every number that didn't belong. Carol tried to interrupt, brushing off my claims as disgruntled speculation. But then the HOA treasurer, a mild, careful man who usually agreed with everything she said, flipped through the documents, pale-faced. He cleared his throat and quietly admitted that he didn't recognize half the transactions on the list. The room went still. For the first time, Carol's composure faltered. Her carefully constructed calm cracked just enough for everyone to notice. Neighbors leaned forward. Cameras clicked. Someone whispered, "How much of this is real?" All of it was real. The meeting ended abruptly as the board voted to suspend all towing partnerships until a financial audit could be completed. Carol left early, without her usual grace, face tight behind forced pleasantries. But I saw fear there, the kind that creeps in when a person realizes their game might finally be over. Back in my garage, I sat in silence. Half relief, half anticipation. Because as much as this felt like victory, I knew her type didn't break easily. Carol wasn't finished. I could almost feel it. And I was right. Because a week later, a plain white envelope appeared under my door. No return address, no markings. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 5 words scrawled in rushed handwriting. You shouldn't have done that. The war had begun. The note under my door confirmed what I already knew. When people like Carol lose control, they don't back down, they double down. For a while, I didn't react. Silence unnerves people like her. They thrive on visible resistance, on shouting matches and public squabbles they can manipulate. So I waited. I let her wonder how much I'd uncovered, how much of her empire was already crumbling. But Carol didn't handle uncertainty well. She struck again the following week. Only this time, she went after my business. An anonymous call to the city inspector's office claimed I was running an unlicensed commercial operation from my house. Another to the county zoning board accused me of dumping industrial waste near a drainage line. It was textbook harassment dressed as civic duty. The inspector who arrived at my home was apologetic. He'd seen this before, vindictive complaints made to bruise reputations. He took one look at my workshop, verified my license, and left shaking his head. But it wasn't about the inspection. It was about the pattern. She wanted to waste my time, slow me down, make me feel the exhaustion of bureaucracy she'd weaponized for years. But instead of slowing me, it steeled me. By then, the HOA's financial audit was underway. Rumors spread like fire. Residents traded stories at mailboxes and in driveways, relieved to speak freely at last. For the first time in years, they weren't whispering, they were comparing notes. Every late fee, every donation, every mysterious payment started surfacing. The numbers told a story uglier than anyone expected. Over $19,000 in questionable transactions connected to a towing contractor registered under a fake post office box. Duplicate reimbursements, missing receipts, consulting fees, with no records of service. It wasn't just embezzlement. It was theft hidden in compliance language. She must have sensed the tide turning. 2 days before the audit results were due, Carol held a neighborhood emergency meeting. She stood at the cul-de-sac like a preacher at a congregation, spinning her narrative one last time. The numbers were exaggerated, the accusations false, the residents confused by online misinformation. But the crowd was different now. People weren't nodding, they were recording. Phones came out, cameras flashed, and for the first time, she saw herself through their lenses. Small, desperate, cornered. The meeting ended when the HOA treasurer arrived with the auditor's statement in his hands. He didn't say a word. He just placed the copy on her folding table. The bold header spoke for itself. Preliminary findings. Misuse of community funds, pending legal review. For the first time since I'd known her, Carol looked afraid. That night, she drove through the neighborhood under the cover of darkness, stopping at driveways, slipping envelopes into mailboxes. Inside each was a letter filled with excuses, half apologies, and shifting blame. Misunderstanding, administrative error, digital confusion. It was pathetic. By morning, those same letters had been posted online. Screenshots flooded the community group page alongside audit excerpts and photos of empty bank ledgers. What she'd tried to spin into secrecy had become a spectacle. Within 48 hours, the local news van was parked outside the HOA office. Reporters interviewed anyone who would talk. Neighbors who'd once tiptoed around her name now spoke loudly into microphones about years of fear and unfair fines. And then the footage broke. A woman caught sneaking records from HOA storage boxes into her car trunk after dark. Her face was unmistakable, even in grainy resolution. It was Carol. That clip hit the air 24 hours later under the headline, HOA President under investigation for financial misconduct. The retaliation she'd launched had backfired spectacularly. Her calls to city offices backfired. The city inspector filed a harassment report. The HOA board filed a complaint citing gross administrative misconduct. Even the towing company, trying to save face, handed over receipts that all pointed back to her signature. The woman who fined people for leaving their trash bins out 10 minutes late now found herself buried under real investigations, the kind she couldn't revoke with a vote or silence with a memo. And through it all, I said nothing publicly. I didn't need to. The truth had long outgrown me. It was living on 1,000 screens now, dissected by internet forums and HOA watchdog groups calling it one of the worst abusive power scandals of the year. But power never dies quietly. A week later, another letter arrived in my mailbox. Typed this time, polite, limp. It read, effective immediately. The Willow Ridge HOA will suspend enforcement activities pending restructuring. They'd folded. No more fines. No more phantom inspections. No more Carol. But victory still felt quiet. Calm in the way a storm feels once it finally burns itself out. And as I looked at my truck parked right back in its rightful place, spotless under the sunlight, I couldn't help but think. She may have started this war, but she'd forgotten one truth that everyone eventually learns. When you weaponize rules, all it takes is someone determined enough to read them better than you do. Her retaliation had started a fire she couldn't control, and that fire had just reached City Hall. The day the news broke, Willow Ridge stopped pretending to be perfect. Overnight, the clean cul-de-sacs and prim driveways became a stage for flashing cameras and neighborhood gossip. The scandal had grown beyond property lines. It was everywhere. The headline read, HOA president under investigation for fraud and misconduct. Underneath it, a photo of Carol, caught mid-denial, hands up, eyes wide, frozen like an animal in headlights. That image alone spread faster than any lie she'd ever told. I hadn't expected the story to go viral, but within hours it was everywhere. Shared on local Facebook groups, featured in investigative podcasts, even commented on by people who didn't know what an HOA was but knew what corruption looked like when they saw it. What exposed her wasn't just the audit, it was her arrogance. She'd spent years dictating, demanding, and demeaning, and when people finally had proof, they didn't hesitate to add their stories to the pile. Homeowners from past neighborhoods she'd managed came forward with eerily similar experiences. Missing dues, threat letters, fabricated fines. She had built a career on control and toppled it through greed. The city investigation uncovered the full scope. Her towing partnership wasn't legal at all. It was a private side deal written off as community safety enforcement. For every car towed, the HOA was billed triple the rate. The company pocketed their portion, and the rest went straight into an account she controlled under a fake business name, WR Neighborhood Logistics. She'd been using HOA dues to pay for personal expenses, everything from spa memberships to airline tickets. The evidence filled dozens of pages, each transaction more absurd than the last. It all came crashing down in a single city press briefing. Cameras captured every word as an auditor detailed the scheme. Behind him, charts projected onto a screen. Payments, dates, her signature. The crowd gasped when they learned just how long it had gone on. 6 years. 6 years of pocketed funds disguised as community maintenance. By noon, the HOA's official website vanished. His bank account was frozen. The state's homeowner association registry listed Willow Ridge as inactive pending review. The organization I'd once dreaded letters from now existed only as a cautionary tale. Neighbors who used to avoid each other out of fear were now united by something else. Anger. People who'd been fined unfairly demanded refunds. Others talked about filing a class action suit. Even those who'd once supported Carol couldn't defend her now. But for me, justice came quietly. The towing company sent me a letter of apology, likely prompted by their legal team, and a check covering every penny I'd lost plus damages. I didn't celebrate. I just held the letter for a long time, realizing that what had started as rage had somehow turned into something far bigger. Because it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about what this whole neighborhood had gone through to get here. We'd learned how fragile peace can be when left in the wrong hands. How easy it is for someone to twist community rules into weapons of control. And how quickly those walls crumble when people finally stand together and say, enough. The state attorney's office pressed charges within a week: embezzlement, fraud, abuse of authority. The story was everywhere. Carol was escorted from her home under a gray sky, cameras flashing. The same neighbors she once intimidated watching from behind open blinds. The image spread online again, captioned simply, HOA president arrested. Residents celebrate. People from other towns reached out to us. They wanted to know how we'd done it, how we'd exposed her. Others said our story gave them hope, that maybe their own HOA nightmares could finally end. The best part was watching how fast Willow Ridge changed after that. With the HOA gone, the rules loosened, but pride didn't fade. Lawns stayed green, porches stayed painted, but it was done willingly, not fearfully. Neighbors checked in on each other not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. For the first time since I'd moved in, the place felt like a neighborhood again. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. A few weeks after her arrest, I drove past the old HOA office one last time. Empty windows, locked doors, the once colorful bulletin board stripped bare except for a sun-faded notice that read Community Matters. I almost laughed, because in the end, the community did matter, just not in the way Carol had ever imagined. Still, one last thing lingered. Her sentencing was weeks away, and rumor had it she planned to speak, to explain herself, to twist the narrative one last time. Nobody believed she'd find mercy, but everyone knew she'd try. Her ego would never let her walk away quietly. And when the court date came, we'd all find out what her version of justice looked like. The morning of Carol's sentencing was eerily quiet. The kind of stillness that settles right before something permanent happens. The courthouse sat at the edge of the city, tall and gray against a silver sky. It felt fitting, cold, heavy, and sterile, a reflection of the weight she'd created for herself. Dozens of familiar faces filled the benches inside. Nearly every homeowner from Willow Ridge had shown up. For months, she had dominated our lives through paper fines, board meetings, and threats. Now, all of us were there to watch the final page of her story turn. She arrived looking smaller somehow. Gone was the posture of superiority, the carefully pressed blazer, the tight smile that used to disguise cruelty. Now, she wore a plain jacket and kept her gaze fixed on the floor. Her lawyer stood beside her, flipping through notes that wouldn't save her. The judge read the charges in an even voice: fraud, falsification of official records, breach of fiduciary duty. Each one sounded like a hammer strike. Every statement was followed by murmurs through the crowd. When it came time for her to speak, the courtroom went silent. Even now, there was a piece of her that clung to the illusion of authority. She cleared her throat and launched into a ramble about miscommunication, about misunderstanding financial logistics. She blamed committee errors, outdated bylaws, clerical mix-ups, everything but herself. But the room wasn't buying it. Not after what the audit proved. The prosecutor didn't need theatrics. Facts spoke louder than any speech. Transaction logs, email chains, contractor statements, and a trail of missing funds, all leading back to her accounts. When the judge finally delivered the verdict, it came with a finality that hung heavy in the air. A guilty finding on every count. She was sentenced to restitution, community service, and 3 years of probation under financial monitoring. No handcuffs, no jail. But her power, that intoxicating thing she wielded like a weapon, was gone forever. As she left the courtroom under the weight of whispers and phone cameras, I expected to feel triumph. But what I felt instead was something quieter: relief. Because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just breathes. When it was over, the crowd poured out into the crisp afternoon air. People hugged, laughed softly, shook hands. There was no more anger left, only closure. The monster that had ruled our neighborhood wasn't a monster at all. Just a flawed human being who mistook control for purpose. In the weeks that followed, Willow Ridge came alive again. Without the HOA's chokehold, residents created something new. A cooperative council, run by volunteers and transparency. No fines, no bureaucracy, just people. Real people looking out for each other. Neighbors shared tools. Through weekend barbecues, Even started a community truck fund to help pay for tools and equipment for anyone working locally. My company ended up helping build a community shed by the park, a place for everyone's projects. Every hammer strike echoed the same truth. This was what a neighborhood should have been all along. The house that once served as the HOA office was converted into a library and meeting space. Someone hung a small wooden sign over the doorway that read, "Fairness starts here." It was poetic and perfect. A few months later, a letter arrived at my address. It was from Carol. I didn't expect to open it. Part of me almost threw it away, but curiosity won. Inside was a brief, shaky handwritten note. She admitted she was wrong, said she had lost herself chasing validation, mistaking leadership for dominance. She wrote that seeing the community rebuild without her opened her eyes to what she'd destroyed. The words weren't an apology so much as a confession of emptiness. I could have ignored it. I could have posted it online. But I didn't. I tucked it into the same folder that once held all her fake invoices and audit reports. Because some evidence is worth keeping, not for vengeance, but for remembering. Life moved on. Today, my truck still sits in the driveway, right where it belongs. No one stares, no one calls it an eyesore. It's a simple sight, but every morning when I look at it, I'm reminded of everything it represents. Work, independence, a fight that turned into change. The funny thing about standing up for yourself is that it always starts small. One misplaced fine, one bogus tow, one person saying, "This isn't right." But when that stand is firm enough, it doesn't just move your fence line, it moves people. Carol's empire fell, but her lesson stayed. Power that feeds on control always collapses on itself. And sometimes it only takes one ordinary person, one truck, and one honest truth to help it fall. Willow Ridge's new motto, painted on the wall of the community park, says it best. What they called rules, we turned into respect. And every time I walk past it, I smile. Because in the end, this wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about taking back what never should have been controlled to begin with.